Okay, well, thank you again for joining us, Grace. And what I was interested in was kind of when you first became aware of what was happening at Sussex. Kind of, did you immediately figure out what was going on, or did it take some time?
Yeah, I think I became aware in different stages. So I think the first thing that I remember was a few years ago, Kathleen Stock and along with a number of other colleagues published a manifesto that was called "Doing Better in Conversations About Sex and Gender," if I remember rightly. And the purpose of that manifesto was to kind of provide something like a sort of liberal rationale for
Mm-hmm.
opposing trans civil rights claims. I think that was more or less the purpose of that document. Um, and you know, it was the first time that I'd seen any document like that. This was in 2019, so I quickly wrote a response, and I felt a little. I mean, it was if I were doing this again, I would have spent a little longer on the response because I didn't quite anticipate that it would be as widely read as it was. But nonetheless, I stand by everything I said in that document. But um, that piece became quite widely read. Uh, Kathleen Stock reached out to, and thinking about this now, this is actually an example of the same thing. Kathleen Stock reached out to me to demand a kind of correction on something
Mm-hmm.
that I hadn't stated in the first thing, which was this query about whether or not I'd heard her give a talk on Jane Eyre a few years previously, and she demanded that I retract the claim that I hadn't quite made. So I happily did because I wasn't 100% sure about it. But then later on, it kind of turned out that indeed I had heard her give this talk, and she sort of confirmed it over email. So looking back at this, and again, I'm thinking of this only for the first time now, but I am among the people who has been threatened with um, a kind of retaliatory harassment on the basis of perfectly legitimate comment.
Yeah.
Anyway, this was years ago, and I didn't really think very much of it at the time. And in fact, last year, 2020, Kathleen Stock had, what struck me as the courage and presence of mind to defend me against defamatory claims that Graham Linehan had directed
Sure.
against me. And I emailed her to thank her, and we had a nice little correspondence then again. And
Mm-hmm.
then,
Mm-hmm.
something seemed to shift later on last year when, the strange thing, and it seemed to be around the kind of Tavistock Bell, initial Tavistock Bell decision.
Sure.
Professor Stock herself sort of repeated a kind of milder version of one of the claims that Linehan had made. She said that there was something revolting about my interest in adolescent females, which was
Right.
such a kind of dramatic escalation from anything I'd heard from her in the past. I was actually sort of, in addition to being horrified, I was quite surprised and quite kind of taken aback. And I emailed her to ask, what had happened, and she never responded. So,
Mm.
you know, from then on, I guess we didn't really have much of a correspondence. But um, the more recent situation is all of the stuff that I've learned in the last few weeks, which has
Right.
really, again, surprised me by the scale and intensity of the problem at Sussex. I did
Right.
not,
Right.
I didn't see it coming, and I was quite surprised. And then I remember a very specific moment when I realized, oh, this is worse than people think, worse than I thought.
Right.
And that was when I heard Adam Tickell on the BBC Radio 4 interview saying that he found it disturbing that students were protesting a member of the academic staff, that there were going to be consequences that he didn't name what they would be for those students, that
Mm-hmm.
disciplinary action would be meted out upon these protesters. And I sort of thought, I have my own investments in this as an academic and as someone profoundly invested in academic freedom as a rubric and as an
Sure.
intellectual protocol. But even if I didn't, it's not right for academic administrators to be making those kinds of threats against students.
Mm-hmm.
That's not normal. That's not, even when things are going quite badly, that doesn't happen. And I say this as someone employed by the University of California, Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
We have had our own struggles with these kinds of questions. But
Sure.
when students protested Milo Yiannopoulos, no administrative faculty, no administrative staff went on the National Public Radio to decry those students and say that they were going to receive
Yeah.
consequences for protesting Milo
And
Yiannopoulos. Now, yeah.
yeah. But I was struck by how quickly the protesters were sort of immediately represented as these threatening individuals who were
Yeah,
clearly there to
terrorists, in fact.
intimidate, and the media just went with that. And that's still the kind of factual basis everyone's working from, is that there was this threat from these protesters.
Yeah,
Whereas I
and
just
no one
saw
can quite
protests.
tell me what that is because, again, I don't have any kind of institutional skin in the game at Sussex, so it's very easy for me to say, students shouldn't. I mean, nobody should be issuing threats of violence against Kathleen Stock or anyone. I mean, of course, I believe that very strongly,
Sure.
and that may very well have happened. I don't know. I just haven't seen evidence for it. And I certainly don't understand how it's quickly become such a consensus. The most tactless thing I've seen from the students' account is that they put up an image that said "Ding dong, the witch is dead" when Stock resigned. I actually DM'd them to say I thought that was in poor taste. Clearly, it was something that they took from the Margaret Thatcher death. I remember that then, and I was annoyed by it then as someone who's marched against Thatcher and her acolytes. But no, the threats are really, if there are threats, and I don't want to deny the possibility there might be, I certainly don't see any evidence they're coming from students, and I think that's highly at odds with the claims that I've seen. However, it's perfectly in line with the attempts over the last few years, of which Professor Stock has been one of the major agents, to demonize and stigmatize trans students. That begins with TERF is a slur, and the notion that simply by referring to someone as a trans exclusionary radical feminist, one is, using a swear word of some kind, which is, clearly a rhetorical gesture designed to make it more difficult to communicate. But it also continues, when there was a talk at the London School of Economics a few months ago where a student had delivered a talk kind of, imaginatively working out what it might feel like to be the target of transphobia and transmisogyny. And one part of this talk it included some notion about, I think there was a line like, you can feel my knife at you can feel my knife at your throat. Now, to me, and to I assume most people, the student was saying two things. Firstly, that the student feels that there is a knife at their own throat, and so there is a kind of phantasmatic reversal of that. And two, that the people opposing the student's civil rights claims are afraid. And one response to that fear is to kind of try to manifest it in some way. I'm not defending it as a tactic or as a piece of writing. I don't write that way, and I don't write that way for a reason. But literally hundreds of people, including academics, including scholars, argued that this was not only sort of unpublishable, but also an act of terrorism that warranted police investigation against the student. And again, I was staggered. I mean, when I saw that taking place on Twitter and the LSE kind of giving into it, I was stunned to see my colleagues labeling a student a terrorist for an imaginative piece of writing. Again, it's not normal. I've never seen anything like it in the history of the university. I keep asking for someone to give me an idea of something that's similar, but in the UK, I just can't think of anything.
I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, because I've been struck by, I've seen the bad faith kind of my free speech is being infringed upon by being criticized. I've seen that for a while. But this kind of students in doing these criticisms are harassing or doing this
harassing,
kind of
and also I'm sorry to keep dragging back the T word, but the word terrorism has been used a number of times to describe student activists, and it just seems to me worth asking why that's happening. Why do people think that's necessary or right? I agree that the sort of my free speech has been compromised by somebody else speaking. That argument's not a good one. I realize that the entire global right is orienting itself to try to make that argument their sort of central electoral plank. We'll see if it works. Didn't in 2016. Sorry, didn't in 2020. It doesn't seem persuasive to me, but this is slightly different. This is an attempt to criminalize students actually for doing their work.
Well, and because in the UK, the whole premise that universities are this kind of group thinking. In the US, a lot of it is about critical race theory and some other issues around, like just a range of kind of woke issues. But in the UK, it's often framed as, and can you believe they're actually silencing feminists, meaning the gender critical feminists? And there's this kind of idea that universities are so out of control that they're actually silencing these kind of women who just want to say biology is real or whatever. And,
no, absolutely.
And that's just such a bad faith representation. But actually,
but it's also just not true. I mean, again, like to sort of, I always get wary. Something we do online a lot is sort of, try to assess people's faith, and we sort of hear someone making a bad argument, and we think they can't possibly believe that. I don't know whether Kathleen Stock believes that she's been silenced or not. I don't know. What I do know is that she, in fact, has not been. And I know that at no point has anyone attempted to stop her from publishing her research or from conducting her research. That part seems, it's very easy to prove, actually. I mean, it's extremely easy to prove.
Right.
And it's also quite easy to prove that the gender critical position has a kind of basic monopoly on center-left media in the UK at the moment. It's not... It's not difficult. It's not, as far as I can see, it's not ambiguous. It's not like there is a kind of difficulty of evidence on either side. I think it's very clear. And I think one of the reasons it's so clear actually is because it's not primarily about trans people, it's about young people. And the real contempt here is being directed generationally, but trans people become this euphemism for kind of generational antagonism. So it's perfectly possible for the gender critical position to occupy The Guardian and the BBC almost entirely, and that's because it's occupied by people who are professional class and people who are older than me. Anyone, I'm 38 years old, and I'm more or less the inflection point. People who are older than me, they tend to be on the side of Kathleen Stock. People who are younger than me don't tend to be on the side of Kathleen Stock. But that's, I think, how it's possible. I think that's how it's possible for people to really create the feeling that they've been silenced, even though, it's very obviously not true, because they just feel this tremendous sense that the views that they have about the world are not going to last. They're being replaced. Their students aren't listening to them. Their audiences aren't buying what they're selling. And, God knows, as a human being, I can sympathize with this. But as someone who has been a kind of marching and practicing and writing and studying and teaching feminist for many years, I remain profoundly, wounded by the damage done to feminist movements and to the women's movement by using trans people as the kind of proxy for this generational antagonism. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point. And so I'm curious, because since you started to investigate kind of because what I'm interested in is you're in the US figuring out more about what's going on in the UK than any journalist in the UK, and it seemed like you were actually able to figure out that this story with Stock is a lot more complicated than it's represented as. This sort of, the reason the representation is that Stock is being silenced for saying women are biology is real, adult human female stuff. And clearly there's a lot of people who believe that, and they aren't getting fired left and right. So she's clearly doing something in addition to just making banal statements. Yes. And it seems like you've actually figured out that she has created something of both she and Adam Tickell as well, it seems like. Yeah. No, he's by far the more culpable person of the two. I think that Professor Stock has really used every opportunity
at her disposal to create a celebrity platform for herself, and she's been very successful. Adam Tickell has enabled that by covering up, some pretty grim, some pretty grim harassment of students. So yeah, I can tell you a little bit about how I started to investigate this, and I can tell you a little bit about what I found. So I was contacted actually on Twitter by one of my Twitter followers who was going to have to go. This was Amelia Jones, actually. This is a name that you may know. Amelia Jones, who was going to go on the BBC television to talk about what was happening at Sussex. She was very anxious because she knows very well that when trans women go on the television, they are usually attacked. Their appearance is usually picked apart, and she was understandably anxious. So she wrongly thought that I had sort of oodles of TV experience, and could I offer her some advice? I sort of said, well, actually, I have no experience of doing TV. I guess I've done this now, but I'm happy to talk in general terms about the kind of issues. So we had a phone call, and she made it super clear what her objections were, and it was the LGBA and it was the WSDC, WDSR, which is to say, what she opposed was one. Her sense of what the students proposed, because she actually wasn't involved in the organization of the protest. Her sense was that they were protesting, one, membership of the LGBA, Professor Stock's trusteeship of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Alliance, and two, her signature to the Women's Declaration of Sex-Based Rights. I think I asked her a little bit, why she objected to those things. She told me, and we talked about it. Seemed reasonable to me, and I said, good luck on the TV. And that was it. And then the next thing I saw, Kathleen Stock had accused this person of having lied about her signature on the Women's Declaration of Sex-Based Rights, or misrepresented the Women's Declaration of Sex-Based Rights, which she hadn't. And I was like, well, that's very odd. I mean, I can almost see how you can maybe disagree with the claim that it's legally eliminationist, because Kathleen Stock's view seems to be, unless I misunderstood this, because she's quite unclear, but I think Kathleen Stock's view is, yes, the Women's Declaration would eliminate the GRA in practice, but it wouldn't prevent us from signing other laws recognizing trans women. So if that's her defense, Amelia's position was the WDSR erases trans women in law. I don't think those two positions are actually contradictory. And I think, and Amelia's position is clearly right. But nonetheless, Kathleen Stock phrased this as a correction that needed to be made. The BBC quite rightly offered her a right of reply, which she then framed as the BBC has corrected Amelia Jones, which was not the case. And then the Daily Mail published a headline saying that Amelia Jones had lied and the BBC needed to apologize for it. And I just sort of felt, what the fuck? How have we allowed, sorry, pardon my, saucy language, but how have we allowed this to happen to a student? A student was going on the TV to report on a protest that she didn't even organize. And then a professor at her own school misrepresents her position, and then it says refutes it with a position it doesn't even dispute. And then three, a national newspaper accuses her of being a liar. I mean, again, I've never heard of this happening in the history of the university. So that was when I just sort of felt like, how on earth has this happened? And what I quickly learned was Professor Stock had, for some time, been using threats of lawsuits and threats of defamation in order to, as she says, defend my reputation. It's a phrase she's used a few times. But what this amounts to in practice is using legal threats to silence students who criticize her. She's never tried to slap me with a legal threat because she knows that I have the resources to defend myself against it, and the threats are vexatious, which is another thing. So I deduce from that, from the fact she's never threatened me with a lawsuit, that she doesn't really believe in the merit of the lawsuit. She simply believes that she can silence someone like Amelia Jones or Katie Tobin because she has the backing of her academic administrators in the British media. And that turns out to be true.
Professors.
And because their students are not professors. So in other words, what I learned was Katie Tobin had an article in which she'd said, Professor Stock's advocacy has been detrimental to the welfare of trans students at Sussex. Perfectly reasonable report of campus climate. By no means something that Professor Stock had any grounds to contest. But of course, she immediately tried to threaten her with a lawsuit. Katie Tobin, being an undergraduate student, didn't have the capacity to do what I would have done, which is call a lawyer. Didn't have the money for it. And so immediately sort of backed down, and then student newspaper that Professor Stock had threatened withdrew the article. Now, to me, that is such a grotesque distortion of the principle of academic freedom, but not just principle of academic freedom. It's preventing the flow of information about campus climate. It stops people from knowing how each other are doing on campus. Just the scale of that. And again, the stuff that I can't talk about in public because I'm working on it at present, but from already the stuff that I've published, you can see that anyone who has come up with a criticism of Kathleen Stock has either been the subject of a vexatious legal threat, which has led to them withdrawing, or they've lost their job, like Nathan Osseroff Spicer did after Kathleen Stock emailed his boss, or three, they've just been the subject of massive online pile-ons directed by Kathleen Stock, which have themselves involved death threats. Now, again, I'm not for a moment claiming that Kathleen Stock is sending death threats to students. I don't think she is. But Kathleen Stock's friends are sending death threats to students, and she doesn't seem to object. And I think that distinction is important on both sides. I don't believe that students are sending death threats to Kathleen Stock either. If students' friends are sending death threats to Kathleen Stock, they need to step up and say that that's not okay. But let's not pretend that this is something that the students are doing. It's something that is being used to discredit the student protests, who are not protesting Professor Stock's freedom of speech or academic freedom, but a pattern of harassment and abuse of students that goes back at least 3 years, and into which the university administration has not done absolutely nothing.
Right, and it seems like that kind of using the institutional infrastructure, the bureaucracy, and then ultimately, it does seem like if Adam Tickell was not the vice chancellor and it was even just another different head of the university, that things would play out differently. But it seems like he's made a choice to not just defend Stock, but actually promote her work and actually promote the idea that she is this kind of victimized professor, and the students are the
people with power. The students are the ones with power. The professors need to be defended from them. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I wouldn't want to make generalizations about the integrity of the class of academic administrators in the UK. I will say that as a bunch in the US, our bosses are not always the most honest or reputable class of people, but it is certainly the case that Adam Tickell has misrepresented the nature of academic freedom, both in his correspondence with students and to the media statements on the BBC. Right. It's clearly true that Adam Tickell has defended Kathleen Stock to the extent of denying her critics the capacity to even speak about their experience in public, which was the condition that was placed on Katie Tobin.
The non-disclosure agreement.
Well, it wasn't a non-disclosure agreement because there was no agreement. It was a threat. A non-disclosure agreement is when two parties agree not to talk about something. What happened was the university said, if you talk about this, we will release this document which contains personal information about you. So Katie Tobin didn't sign anything agreeing to that. She simply was made subject to that threat.
So I guess that's why she was able to do
never heard of that before. Sorry?
Yeah. I guess that's why she was able to do it after she left. It wasn't a legally binding NDA. It was more like, we will make your life difficult if you choose to do this.
Well, they could still do it, and Katie is, I think, is hoping that they don't. I hope that they don't. I hope they don't make good on that threat. But I mean, there are things that Katie Tobin has told me about that letter that I can't disclose in public. But there's been a lot of speculation about why it was that she wouldn't want this document published. All I can say about that is that these documents very frequently contain very intense personal information about all the parties and their experiences during the time of contention. Right. So, there may very well be in such a document incredibly sensitive personal information that would be profoundly disadvantageous to have in the public domain.
Submitted with an idea of confidentiality into a complaints system, because it strikes me that the complaints system, whether or not we want to talk about the individual of Stock, the individual of Tickell, I mean, it seems like the system of complaints for harassment is just broken
It's broken.
the
At
UK?
Sussex, it's broken insofar as it comes to Professor Kathleen Stock. I don't know whether it's more broadly broken. I have heard, though I haven't been able to confirm with my own from my own primary sources, I've heard that the threat that was issued to Katie Tobin was not standard practice. So I would want to know why it was issued in that particular case.
Right.
Whether or not it was issued to everyone who criticizes Kathleen Stock, or whether in particular this individual critic of Kathleen Stock. I also have learned from another case of someone reporting that they had been that their welfare had been compromised by Kathleen Stock's advocacy, and the equity officer at University of Sussex told her that that was not an appropriate complaint, and then dishonestly or misleadingly anyway told her that Kathleen Stock was no longer teaching students but had been moved into an admin role. Wasn't true. No idea where it came from. But again, one gets the impression of an administration that is just going out of its way to protect this individual, not merely from consequences, but from scrutiny. And I've no idea why. I mean, it's, you know, I just don't know why. I really don't know why. And I don't wish Kathleen Stock any ill. I want there to be an answer to this question.
Yeah,
Bob Phillip.
And it seems like there's this claim that there's no willingness to debate from, let's say, your side of the argument. I mean, you referenced several different deep familiarity with her positions and kind of have corresponded, have argued in print, have done. So this idea that there is no debate is just that there is a debate, and it's just
I think a lot of people.
It's perhaps heated at times, but.
Yeah. You know, I mean, again, Kathleen Stock published an article called Doing Better in Discussions of Sex and Gender. And I published a response called, you keep using this phrase, adult human female. It does not mean what you think it means. Or something like, I may have the title a little bit wrong on both sides. Right. But yeah, she published, I published. It was a debate. I'm very familiar with her arguments. I have to say, you know, I don't, in general, regard them as the kinds of philosophical claims that I'm most interested in getting stuck into. Sure. You know, I come from a different philosophical tradition in terms of my own scholarship. You know, I am a sort of, my own scholarship is mostly, I would suppose, you know, invested in Kantian thought and in Freudian thought, neither of which have very much to do with the kinds of traditions that Professor Stock's working with, which is no criticism there. It's quite right that people, you know, work in different traditions and that there is freedom to do that. You know, the problem, and Krista Peterson will be able to talk about this better than I can, but the problem from a philosophical perspective with Kathleen Stock's position is that she's often confused defending the merits of Proposition P with defending the idea that Proposition P is censored, such that if you can prove that an idea is being censored, that it is therefore meritorious by implication, which I think is a sort of very murky idea. I also don't think her position is being censored, but it's also just, I think it's interesting that she seems to have fairly directly or deliberately conflated those two ideas. Yeah. I, however, want to say here and want to say loudly, I will appear on television sitting next to Kathleen Stock in a heartbeat. When I'm planning a tour of the UK to promote my book in March.
Oh, great.
And, you know, my UK publicist, God bless them, one of the first things they said to me was, don't worry, we won't put you on TV with anyone bad. And I was like, no, please put me on TV with someone you don't like or you think doesn't like me. Yeah. I'm dying for that conversation. I believe that I would be able to have this conversation successfully with Kathleen Stock or with fucking Graham Linehan or whomever. I'm dying to be part of this argument. Yeah. But instead, you know, what happens is you get two talking heads from British universities talking about how sad it is that no one wants to debate them. And I'm like, I'm right here. I will debate you any place, anytime. Let's do an event right now. Yeah. If anyone from that side is watching this video, please, you have my email address. The only reason I'm not saying it out loud now is because whenever I do, I get death threats. But you can find my email address very easily online. Email me. We will set something up. I will do that anytime at all.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it. And that's actually a lot of the motivation for us to set up this free speech program was to say, you know, you say you don't want to debate, and we invite everyone to debate, and no one comes. Only person who came is Eric Kaufman, but I really do hope that when you come around in March, hopefully things will be in person as well, and there'll be a really
Yeah,
vigorous
I've definitely got a couple of
discussion.
in-person events lined up that I'll be announcing in due course, but I'm excited about.
Well, I will let you go because I know you've got a plane to catch. But thank you so much for
Thank you so
joining us
much.
today.
It's been a pleasure, Eric.
Grace.